I'm Dwayne King, Vice President for Vis Affairs at the University of Tulsa and Executive Director of the Vis Center for American Research. I want to thank you again for your support of public programming of the Vis Center, and thank you for being here and participating in this symposium. Our first speaker today is Dr. Brent Seales, Professor and Chairman of the Department of Computer Science and Director of the Center for Visualization and Virtual Environments at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Seales earned his Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was a postdoctoral researcher at the French National Institute for Research in Computer Science and Control. The digital recovery by Dr. Seales of readable text within the Ein Gedi scroll was recognized by Christianity Today magazine as the most significant discovery in biblical archaeology in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brent Seales.
Thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here this morning. First time in Tulsa. Really love this place, and I want to thank Ann for inviting me, and Dr. King, thank you for the great introduction. It just so happened that our paper came out this week, and I'm going to talk about it today. So this is the first talk that I've had a chance to give since the paper was released. The embargo lifted on Wednesday of this week. Let me show you this. We got a lot of press. And that you know that you've arrived when you make the page of the Drudge Report. You see in the lower left a reference to my article. Yeah, so it circulated pretty widely this week, and that was all out of our control. We just released the paper. And what I want to do with my time today is give you some insight into my thinking during the 2 decades that I've been working as a computer scientist and a scholar interested in the humanities. In particular, I was introduced to the world of damage when I began work at the British Library in the mid-90s. That work was part of the digital library movement, which had to do with the digitization of everything so that it could be put online, cataloged, and searched and made accessible. But I quickly realized that there were materials that were really resistant to digitization. Like, if step 1 is digitize something, what do you do with a scroll from Herculaneum? So the world of damage is the way I started looking at the idea of digital libraries. And I became an expert at damaged materials and ways that technology can help us reverse some of that damage. And I want to tell you about that progression this morning. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different trip through this material than you might be accustomed to. I'm a computer scientist. I'm going to focus on geometry. Geometry is fairly straightforward. We've all studied it in grade school. And Euclid, 2,000 years ago, wrote one of the most important treatises on geometry. So I'm going to start with things that are flat, and I'm going to move to things that are wrinkled, and then we're going to talk about things that are completely three-dimensional. So part 1, let's talk a little bit about layers. You've seen a lot of examples already from the other speakers of work that they've done where they show you the results as images in layers. And I also have done some of that work, and it turns out to be a really compelling way to show some of your results. You're seeing here an image of the Venetus A, which is the oldest complete copy of Homer's Iliad. It's located in the Marciana Library in Venice. We had the chance to digitize this manuscript, and it had only been photographed prior to our digitization one time by an Italian by the name of Comparetti in 1908. And what you're seeing is a page from Comparetti's facsimile. Now, if I show you as a layer what we were able to capture, you can see that the detail and the color as compared to the Comparetti really pops out. And in fact, if you look at a small section, you note that that text is actually in color, which wasn't accessible from the Comparetti photography because it was 1908, it was black and white. You also notice that the lenses and the film resolution of 1908 sort of failed in terms of the ability to capture all the detail. If I fade to what we were able to capture, you can see a complete difference. And if I show you side by side, there were some surprising results. On the left, you see Cobretti's detail of one of the figures. On the right, you see that we were able to actually capture less of that particular detail because over the 100 intervening years, things actually disappeared. So to take that example and show you as a fade, I'm going to fade now from 1908 to 2008. And you see the power of the layer. So what I've done here is I've taken two samples in time separated by 100 years, and then I've aligned those two samples so that when I play it as a movie for you, you see the difference between the two things. I call this diachronic registration, which is a professor's way of saying time-lapse, right? They're aligned over time. And we started thinking the layer is a really powerful way that you could do time-lapse for something that's been photographed many times in history. And we started working on this problem. I want to give you, by way of motivation, another example that came to me during some of this work. A woman by the name of Cheryl Sequist sent me a letter, and you're seeing a picture of what she sent. It was a one-page letter from her father that had faded because she displayed it in her home, and she wanted to know if I could recover it. And we played around with this. It was early for multispectral imaging. We didn't really have the capability, but we found this transformation as purely a computer science transform in color space, if that means anything to you. And we were able, from that transformation, to do a complete restoration of the letter to make it look like this. Now, I have to say, this letter from an unknown person piqued in me sort of an unexpected passion that I didn't realize that I had as I had gotten into damage. The father was writing to his daughter from a landing ship tank in World War II. And this is, through the power of the internet, the actual ship he was writing from. And as you read the close of the letter, you can see, be a good girl, oceans of love, your daddy Frank. Isn't that touching, right? Isn't that amazing? So what started to compel me about the technology was the marriage of that with the narrative. Because we're talking about stories, right? And there isn't anything more powerful than a great story. So, layers, the narrative, and also the idea of restoration. Because layers let you see damaged things and then postulate a restoration. Another manuscript that we had the chance to digitize comes from the Chad Gospels. It comes from Lichfield Cathedral, where there is an early Latin Vulgate copy of the Gospels called the Chad Gospels. You're seeing a page of that, and I want to show you a blown-up region that shows you the damage on this gospel. But if I give a graphic artist a copy of this image, and I allow the graphic artist to postulate a restoration, you can imagine someone being able to reconstruct what was actually there without any risk to the damage of the original. So let me take a more detailed shot because the photography is very high level resolution. And let's say on this Celtic kind of diagram, we add an imagined restoration. You see that for no risk, you can imagine a scholarly restoration that brings this alive. It makes it pique the imagination of who can look at it. And you know how nice that it's not invasively, physically damaging, because we all know what happens if you might turn someone loose on the real object, right? You might end up with something much worse. So in this first section of a geometric look, for my trip through my work, I came onto principles of layers for visualizing material, and how that could support the idea of digital restoration, and how powerful the idea of alignment is when you take two things and you line them up perfectly so that you can see the difference between them. There are various tools that came out of this, but let me show you some videos and some examples from the Chad Gospels that will let you get an insight into especially alignment. All right, on the left you see a photo that was taken from 2003, and on the right you see a reproduction from 2010. And I'm going to show you a video that aligns one to the other. Did you see the jiggling that went back and forth? Okay, that's the computer program that we wrote that optimizes how one of them fits onto the other one. We treat one image like it's completely elastic, as if it were on a sheet that we could just stretch and turn any way we needed to. And by doing that, we can make them line up perfectly. And when they line up perfectly, you can do this layer-based thing. It's going to repeat one more time. Why don't they automatically align? Well, they don't automatically align because if you photograph them with different equipment at different times, all of the geometry is going to be such that they'll never match up exactly. So this computer program allows you to go ahead and reverse all of that. All right, let me upgrade now in our geometric block and talk about wrinkles. And when I talk about wrinkles, I don't mean on me, although I suppose over the time I've been working, a few of those have appeared. I began work at the British Library in 1995 on something called the electronic Beowulf. I was not the lead in the study. I was the junior computer scientist at the time as an assistant professor. I helped with my graduate students implement the first outstanding and amazing 1995 Mac version of the electronic Beowulf, an electronic edition of the Beowulf manuscript. But what I also noticed in beginning that work was that nothing we were photographing was actually flat. We were making layers, and we were making photographs that assumed it was flat, but they weren't. And so I started immediately thinking, well, I'm a computer scientist and a computer vision expert. Why don't we capture more information about what we're photographing than just the photograph? Maybe we could capture the actual shape. Maybe we could capture the wrinkles. So we did. We built a system that allowed us to take every page, and in addition to photographing it, we could capture every ridge, every wrinkle as a three-dimensional shape. And you're seeing here a system we invented to be able to do that. We didn't invent the arm that we're using to capture 3D. We invented the software that put everything together into the same frame after we captured the data that we wanted. It's all non-invasive, and this appeared in Wired magazine, and the headline was, "Robot Scans Manuscript," okay? But actually, Matt Field scanned the manuscript, my assistant, and we put it all together so that we could do the following. Restoration in the world of wrinkles began to have meaning for us in terms of pushing those wrinkles flat. If you capture the disposition of every page, and what you're seeing here is our visualization of taking that page with its shape and then pushing it flat, creating an image that looks like what it should be like when you photograph it, but it's the photograph that you can't actually take because the pages aren't flat. It's all about this simulation and this restoration, and the fact that you can do it digitally because you've captured enough information to be able to do that. So we developed this principle of digital flattening to deal with this upgraded geometry of wrinkles, and then we pushed all that back to layers where you could see, okay, here's the flattened page. Let's see what that looks like next to the original page. And you can put them on top of each other and see how they align. Let me show you a couple of pages from one of the manuscripts in the Cotton collection of the British Library. This was probably the Otto A6 or B10. Lives of the Saints, maybe, Alfred the Great. I'm not quite remembering. But I'm looking at this geometrically, so I want you to see the off-axis look at the shape, and then as I flip, you'll see how the lines become lines, the hills go away. Basically, we've removed the wrinkles. Okay, another example shows you the way the page is not anywhere close to flat. And that's because the vellum is inside paper frames, a restoration that was done probably a couple hundred years ago. The two materials are different, and so they end up causing wrinkles in the way the two materials flex at different rates under different conditions. We flatten that out, and you can see that the text becomes nice and linear as it should. But we don't assume anything about the text or any of the properties. It's purely a geometric look at the shape from being wrinkled to being flat. All right, so now we've come to the place where we can talk about the third level of geometry. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that. Complete unwrapping. My thinking started to move toward What about things that are completely wrapped up? Not just wrinkled, but completely wrapped up. And there's no better example of that than the scrolls from Herculaneum. These scrolls are iconic, and were first presented to me in 2004 by Dr. Richard Janko, who is a professor of classics at the University of Michigan. And he took me personally in 2004 to Naples to see the collection. And if the Secret letter and the work with the Chad Gospels and others hadn't gotten me hooked, then when I saw these materials, I looked at them with the eyes of a scientist who is interested in solving a really hard problem. I thought to myself, how can we read those? And I didn't know what the answer was, but I began thinking about a solution. You know the story, Vesuvius explosion, AD 79. Most familiar maybe with the wreckage from Pompeii, because the archaeology there is absolutely stunning, and of course we also have human remains. But in Herculaneum, we have narrative, because there was a library there, the Villa of the Papyri. And the power of story is what has always appealed to me. And so I descended, as Wordsworth's poem calls us out, into the group of people who patiently explore the wreck of Herculaneum lore. And I mean, this is a wreck. This is what the fragments look like when they're physically opened. This corpus of information from Herculaneum, from the Villa of the Papyri, is huge. And yet, when it's opened, you see the damage, and you see the inability to get even a single wrap off of these scrolls without having them completely decay. The physical process involved very hot pyroclastic flow that created something called carbonization. The scrolls were carbonized by being burned but not consumed, and it changed some of the properties to make them very, very hard to open. And the ones that had been opened were begun with a machine by Antonio Piaggio 200 years ago. And many of that material exists and scholars work on it. But what I was postulating is a virtual unwrapping, not unlike what we had been doing with wrinkles and layers. So let me show you a first example in this line of thinking, where we used a commercially available machine in the basement of the University of Kentucky's Medical Center. And we put a fragment into that machine and we scanned it, and this is what the data looked like. I'm going to play this data as a movie, and you're looking at a three-dimensional volume that represents our sample, but I'm playing it as if you were slicing it end on. First slice, second slice, third slice. So that's how you're seeing the data. And now that you've seen all the data, you should be able to tell me what it says, because that's the whole data set right there. Well, you know, that's the trick, right? You can have all the data, but it has to be converted. It has to be converted into a way, geometrically, that you can understand it. And this is the wrong geometry. The volume is there, but we're seeing it in the wrong way. So we built software to do the conversion. This is the software that takes that original sample and puts it into something we understand, which is a surface that can be unfurled in 3 dimensions and then turned into a wrinkled surface that can be flattened to a plane. So you see the whole chain of the geometry from 3D to 2D back to a layer. That simulation became the basis of our first version of the code for solving this problem. And we used it to generate more examples. And here you'll see what we were able to pull out of that data, and then a little bit of image processing, and then the comparison to the original sample. We experimented with a lot of things in the lab. We wrote in inks, we used different materials, we carbonized them. I probably destroyed 500 samples out in Jessamine County, Kentucky, in my friend's kiln before we figured out how to carbonize without consuming. It's actually a complete miracle that the library survived, I have to tell you, because the tolerance for error on carbonization is so small that it was just the right distance from the flow, and it probably got covered up just with the right amount of time so that it didn't bake too long or too short. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. But if you take a look at this example, you see the original, the carbonized, and then our unwrapping compared to a letter form. And that unwrapping comes only from the data. We were pretty convinced that we were onto something at this point that would work. And we developed the complete framework that goes like this. Let me scan something with a volumetric, non-invasive technique. And then we'll be able to convert that scan through segmentation into a representation that will let us see what's written inside. And following that conversion, we'll be able to write some we'll be able to invent some ways to visualize that so that you can see it the way you want to see it, which is as if it were all flattened out. I want to give you some insight in a very intuitive way about the imaging before we go forward, because I think this will help you with the rest of the talk. So I'm going to play a short video for you.
For thousands of years, people have written on scrolls. The scrolls can contain historical records, religious texts, or stories, but many of them have been damaged over time. For example, the Ein Gedi scrolls found near the Dead Sea were in a building that had burned down, leaving the scrolls charred, blackened, and brittle. But since the Ein Gedi scrolls with crumbled ash is opened, how can we ever unlock their contents? There is, in fact, a way to read scrolls without damaging them. Imagine for a moment that a baker has two types of dough. The white dough represents papyrus, and the red dough represents ink. Using the red dough, the baker can create a pi symbol on the white dough. When the baker rolls up the dough, the pi symbol is obviously no longer visible, just like when papyrus is rolled up. Imagine the effects of time and the environment are this evident, baking the pastry for 1,000 years. If the pastry were still soft, the baker could simply unroll it, but now it would break and the information would be lost. The baker can, however, slice the pastry and decode the message from the traces of red dough in each slice. Using sophisticated technology, it is now possible for the scrolls to be digitally unrolled without ever damaging the scroll. It's important for damaged scrolls containing unique, ancient information to be both physically and digitally preserved. There are many ancient scrolls which are too damaged to read, but likely contain historically enlightening information. Digitization and virtual unwrapping allow us to view this otherwise inaccessible information.
I'd like to thank my son for that video. He did the stop motion as a project, and it took him 2 days of shooting before he did the edit. And it took a half a day to do that final scene to unwrap all that dough in stop motion. Does that give you some intuition? So the X-ray is giving us those slices. It's a non-invasive way to get that. And then once we get that, we can do everything in software. So now I want to talk about our work with the Herculaneum collection. Because in 2009, on the strength of our work, we were able to finally get an agreement from the Institut de France to do work with real Herculaneum material that they have in their library in Paris. My colleague Daniel Devatra, who was a researcher before he retired at the Sorbonne, and Madame Pastereau, who was the librarian, made the case for Monsieur Leclerc, who was the head of the academy at the time, and he agreed to allow us to collect data and attempt to read those scrolls. We were looking for the possibility of 3 things. Maybe there is a shape indentation we would be able to see that would give us a cue to the writing. Maybe the chemistry of the ink was such, because of impurities or other things, that we would simply be able to see the ink very easily in the X-ray. Or maybe through a little bit more sophisticated set of techniques, we could tease out what we were looking for. This video shows you those moments where we were taking that scroll, making scans. This is Fabienne Carew, Madame Carew, who was the conservator, actually handling one of the scrolls. I never touched it, but I did use a laser-based system to create a representation of the shape of the outside of the scroll so that we could build a case, which you're seeing here, that form-fitted the scroll so that it could be placed upright in the machine, because it needed to do a pirouette so that we could collect the x-rays. And this is the first radiograph that came off of the scanner from that scroll. You can see a seam that goes vertically in the middle of the picture. That's the seam of the case itself. And you see the texture of the polyurethane foam on the left-hand side. That's the foam case. And you should see some very light straps on the upper left-hand side. That's our very sophisticated high-technology closure system, which I call a rubber band. This is what the slices looked like when we did the reconstruction. So now imagine again that we've sliced the scroll and you're looking at the end. That's what it looks like. And what you're seeing is the structure of all of that rolled up papyrus. When I saw this, and now I'm going to play for you this movie in the same geometric way as the other movies, well, let's just say we weren't prepared for this. The structure was a lot more complicated than we thought it would be. Our computer programs were not capable of handling the amount of data and the complexity of the data. In fact, and you can look at this for a while because it's pretty mesmerizing. And I have. I'm looking for letters, of course, but you end up seeing, all kinds of other things in the data. These were the samples. Okay, that's what we were doing with our software. This is reality, okay? So, of course, the question comes, what about the writing? The press was interested. Actually, that picture of the scroll being scanned on the outside with the laser appeared in the Wall Street Journal, so the press was interested even then. But what they got after the fact was that we hadn't made progress. And my own hometown paper wrote this article, UK scientists stymied in their efforts. And, UK here means University of Kentucky, so I'm sort of happy that it might be a diversion over to the UK. And honestly, to be fair to the reporters, it's exactly where we were. We were blocked, we were stuck. If you Google Seales stymied, you will always now and forever find this article. Okay? But what we had learned in this, really, really important things about scanning and 3D visualization and the entire pipeline. I mean, we'd done real samples and we'd gotten real data. It's just that, as Fenella said yesterday, it's not CSI. It doesn't happen in one episode, right? It takes time. We were also able to produce very accurate facsimiles of the things we scanned. And so I'm going to pass around a 3D printed facsimile that came directly from the data. And I just want you to touch this because it's a very accurate representation down to 25 microns of what the surface of these things feel like. And you're never going to be able to hold the real thing. So I'm going to send this around and you can see what you think. All right, well, I took everything that I'd learned and I wrote it up in a paper, Daniel Delatra and I, and it appeared in 2013. Because I thought, we've got to jolt this project. I wasn't making progress. And in the paper, I talked about new techniques that might be available to do new scans that could help us discover a way to overcome the obstacles. And that eventually was picked up, and last year, John Seabrook wrote an article in the New Yorker about all of the work we've done with Herculaneum material. It's called The Invisible Library, and you can go out and read it. I suggest if you have interest, it's a really nice piece. But one thing that I disagreed with is the way John ended the article. And maybe this is something about being in New York instead of being in the heartland, but this was the ending of the article, so I'm just going to spoil it for you. I do not expect this scroll to be read during my lifetime, Delatra said finally. He closed the lid of the small box with both hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay. After all the work of reading this article, because it's pretty long, he ends it that way. I think you can probably imagine that I am not that kind of guy, right? So now I'm going to move to Ein Gedi because I think we can close the loop, and we'll talk a little bit about Herculaneum as I finish. But let's just say to pass this prologue, and I want to talk about the restoration and discovery of the actual Ein Gedi scroll. This is what it looks like in cross-section. And you see the color highlights, that's our software, which over the time has matured to the place where we can use it in real operation. Here's our screen showing an operator detecting a layer with the help of automated tools inside the computer program, and that layer helping us, that layer problem propagating into the transformation that you need to move the data from the scan into the way that you actually need to visualize. We took that data, and I obtained it from Penina Shore of the Israel Antiquities Authority purely through a cold call because she had heard about our efforts with Herculaneum and wondered if it might be possible to do something with her scroll. So that was totally how it worked. I flew to Los Angeles, California, where Penina was hosting a Dead Sea Scroll exhibit. It was easier to meet in the US, and she handed me in a 1-hour meeting a disk that had 1 terabyte worth of data on it. And she said, well, good luck, have fun. And so I took that data back to the lab, and we started working with the software you're seeing behind me. And ultimately, when Penina, after a few months, queried me and said, hey, you know, what's been going on? I haven't heard from you. This was what we had at the time. We had this image. I knew that we were seeing writing. This image wasn't great, and you can see in the lower right center a lot of distortion, and I wasn't very proud of the image at the time. But because Penina was asking about a report, and I really needed to respond, I simply attached that to an email and said, this is incomplete, but it's what we have for now. And she sent me back this email. Dear Brent, you won't believe what groundbreaking discovery you have made. It is still all hush-hush because we want to have a press conference about it next week. And that was where I went, what? What you have deciphered is, and this is where I have the slide that says mind blown, right? Because she told me that this was Leviticus and that they can simply read it from that terrible image, right? From that image, which is not the one I'm most proud of, okay? But she wanted to have the press conference immediately because they were able to read and identify it. So regardless of what else got extracted, they knew it was Leviticus, and therefore it was a huge discovery. So I didn't impede the press conference. She actually had the date wrong at the time because she misread the radiography report, the radiocarbon report, but I'll tell you more about that in a minute. We had the press conference. I didn't even have time to get to Israel. So I lined up my students in my office, and through Skype, with them looking like little angels sitting on my shoulders telling me what to do, we had a full hour press conference. And in the picture, you see Penina on the left, David Merkel on the right, who did the scan, and in the center, the original archaeologist who pulled that fragment from the ground in 1970, Sept. He came out of retirement, he's 80 years old. It was an amazing moment and a powerful moment, but the nagging thing for me was that science hadn't been done. There was no technical paper. We knew that we could extract better results and that my pipeline could be refined because every time you get an example, it pushes forward the work. Another thing that was just shocking was that we'd done all the work from the data and had never seen the real scroll. And when we discovered its size, because we really didn't think about the scale, we realized that it was the size of something that fits in the palm of your hand. So now I'm going to pass around the second replica, which is the Ein Gedi scroll replica. And you can see this is exact scale replica. Again, a miracle of survival. This thing was found in the Holy Ark of the floor of a synagogue on the shore of the Dead Sea, excavated in 1970. And that Holy Ark, this photo was taken by Sept, he sent it to me, was completely unexpected in terms of its discovery. And it is now a national park, so if you go there, you can stand on this site and take your own pictures, and I have. And I think they're going to probably upgrade how they've labeled all the sites, and they'll talk about this scroll. I want to show you now the video that we produced for this week's press conference, because in the intervening year, we perfected our software and the results that we were able to extract, and I want to show you the result.
Virtual unwrapping begins by acquiring a three-dimensional volumetric scan of the damaged manuscript. This scan produces a set of cross-sectional images that show the internal structure of the scroll. When viewed as a 3D object, one can clearly see the individual layers of the scroll, but any text on the surface of those layers is obscured from view. In order for a readable version of the scroll to be produced, these images must be passed through our virtual unwrapping pipeline. First, we capture the 3D shape of the layers of the scroll in a process called segmentation. On the left side of the screen, the software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces. Next, we extract the ink from the data in a process called texturing. Using the 3D shape generated by segmentation, our software makes another pass through the scroll, this time looking for very bright pixels. Bright pixels indicate regions of dense material, in this case, inks made with iron or lead. We now have a single wrap of the scroll with the text shown clearly on its surface. However, because the surface is curved, it's difficult to read all of the text from one viewpoint. The flattening stage of our pipeline converts this textured 3D surface into a flat plane so that the text can be more easily read. To produce the best results, these 3 steps must be performed on one small section of the scroll at a time. As a result, we end up with several texture images that must be merged together. This merging process creates a single consolidated image that shows the full text. Using this pipeline, we have restored and revealed the text of 5 complete wraps of the Ein Gedi scroll. The 2 distinct columns of Hebrew writing reveal the scroll to be the book of Leviticus. This marks the Ein Gedi scroll as the earliest copy of a Pentateuchal book ever found in a holy ark, a significant discovery in biblical archaeology.
Thanks. There's my daughter who did the voiceover. The price was right. But I love the sound of her voice, so. All right, so you see the difference, and you see why we wanted to have another shot at releasing, real results, because the part that we released a year ago was just the very center part, and it wasn't very well done because we hadn't perfected some of the steps in the pipeline. But now we have a complete geometric pipeline that takes us in the reverse direction by doing the unwrapping, smoothing out the wrinkles, and creating the layers. This solution pipeline is what I call it, is part of what we presented in the paper. And we released all the data, from the raw data to what we segmented to the final image. So everything is out there for critique and for other people to build on what we've done, which I actually think is very important. And let me just make a comment on this. I am telling you that we have discovered a text inside something that none of us are ever going to be able to open. Can you imagine the ability for someone to fake that up, right? So you have to have a provenance chain that goes from the original scan and the original object all the way through to the texture claim, and it has to be open for people to inspect it. If you simply publish a paper that says, I saw this, and no one can refute it, that's not scholarship, right? And it's not going to further our effort at doing more and more in this area. All right, so I'm going to finish with my epilogue, which I call actual virtual unwrapping. It's a great pleasure for me to give a talk like this now, because for a decade and a half, I had to end the talk by saying that I thought there was great possibility, but we weren't there yet. So let me put a little bit of this in context by giving you the timeline so that you can see the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Second Temple period from about 500 BC to 33 AD, or CE, if you will. And then you can see the Aleppo Codex at 930 CE. So there's a huge gap in information that we have on the Hebrew Bible. So being able to place the scroll from Ein Gedi in 3rd century, which is where the radiocarbon dating actually places it, is pretty amazing, and it might actually be earlier from the paleography, we're not sure. For reference, you see Herculaneum at the very end of the Second Temple period, and Chad Gospels at AD 730. Anything that punctures that 900 years of near silence is really, really interesting. Now, what about Herculaneum? Let me just say a few things. I postulated phase contrast tomography would be a thing to do, and teamed up with a group shortly after I wrote my paper to be able to do that experiment. A group from Italy worked with me to get access to the very fragments I had scanned in 2009, the French fragments, the ones you're holding the replica of. And we did an experiment in the fall of 2013, when I had just come back from Google. And they embargoed the data on their own and went to publication with the data without me. And so you see the paper that they published in Nature, where they claim to have revealed letters in Herculaneum. And you see the 4 authors, I'm not one of them, and you see my colleague, Daniel DeLatra, who worked with them and didn't include me. Here are their results. These are what they read. These are the letters they revealed. So you see the word Toya, Aipoye. The middle one on the bottom, I affectionately refer to Essentially, I don't believe any of these results, so I just wanted to go ahead and say that. If you conveniently refer to the Greek letters on the chart, you can ask the question, are we really seeing those letters clearly? Are we seeing them clearly enough for somebody to say we're reading these letters? So on the top, you see the result from that paper. And then you see two sections that I just cropped out of the data so that I could show you what the fibers look like. And, you know, the patterns are pretty similar because the way the fibers of the papyrus light up, they're axis-aligned fibers orthogonal to each other. And you can take a claim that they've made, and then I can give you a whole bunch more claims. Those surrounding images are all images that I selected from the data, and I don't believe they're letters, but they actually look more like letters than what they produced. If you go to your paper, you'll find that, if you go to their paper, you'll find that no data has been released, no information about where they say they found in the data anything is released. Basically, this has been, for me, a real disappointment because I think it sets the whole field behind on the concept of reading material from Herculaneum. And so I'm not going to stand for allowing this to be the final word on that. I'm continuing to work on Herculaneum material because I know what it looks like when you can see the writing. I want to show you another example. We had the chance earlier this year to scan a complete codex, a manuscript from the Cathedral of Sept outside of Paris. This was badly burned in the Allied bombings of World War II, where an accidental salvo hit near the cathedral and burned some things in the library. It's kind of heartrending, isn't it? To have to see, you know, this damage. But when you scan this, and here's a cross-sectional slice, you see all those bright spots. That's actual writing. And when you look at the volume, does anybody not believe there's writing in there? I mean, you can instantly tell that there's writing and then you can see it in the volume. And it's not hard to confirm it or verify it, and it's not hard for me to believe that I could take my software and find a section, follow that section as per our software allows, flatten it, and then see actual writing in Latin from that volume. We did this in an hour in our hotel room after we got the scan. So it is now possible to read from things like Herculaneum and other places. Simply has to be done in a way that's verifiable and careful. Let me show you the gamut of things that I know about that are really interesting that I would love to be able to read. This is probably Ezekiel. It's from the Dead Sea Scroll collection from Qumran. Paper conservation, probably impossible, but the belief is that there are internal layers that probably show some interesting things. This is the Franklin papers. These were found on a cadaver in the Northwest Passage area after the complete loss of the Franklin expedition. It's the only writing from the Franklin expedition that's ever been discovered. This is cartonnage. It comes from one collection at Oxford, but there are buckets of cartonnage in the world, and many of it's very interesting, and you heard from Mike Toth yesterday about ways to read cartonnage and how it's important to do it without soaking it in palm olive and taking apart the layers. And finally, I'd like to say that at Oxford University in the Bodleian Library, there are 3 intact Herculaneum scrolls in their collection. Never been looked at, never been worked on. Because I believe this is a frontier, I've asked the library to be willing to partner with me to see if we can push the Herculaneum work forward, and I believe that we can. I believe that we're going to be able to move things forward to this level of quality. So this is the image that appears in my paper, and if you take a highlighted section and blow it up, you'll see at 1500 DPI, which is widely considered to be archival quality, because the scan was at 17 microns, so precise, we can basically support not only reading, but paleography, letter form analysis. So it was what we did in our paper, in addition to simply showing the technology works. We worked with biblical scholars to whom we sent a 5x blow-up photograph. And again, that's not really a photograph, right? It's a complete rendering of the twists and turns from the internal volume, first wrapped up, then pressed flat with the wrinkles ironed out, and then created into this image. We sent them that photograph, and from that, they were able to do a complete paleographic analysis. And so, along with our technical paper this week, we we also released a companion paper that does the complete biblical scholarship, and I think you'd find that interesting too if you find that paper out there. So, ultimately we have for scale on the right a picture of the real scroll and a penny for scale, and then you see the writing. The writing is very, very small. It is about the size of the writing that's on the penny. So that's how you can sort of gauge the size of the writing. It's probably shrunk a little bit because of the fire. So I'd like to say, in this image, you see God's name twice. In God we trust in English, and you see God's name in Hebrew. And that's why I picked the penny. I think that's kind of cool. And you know, after 2,000 years, you open it up and you find a text that's in your Bible. That's pretty neat. I feel blessed. Thank you.